My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 34 years old. The morning my husband signed our divorce papers, he leaned back in his leather chair, looked at me across the conference table, and said, "I honestly feel bad for you. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you're leaving with nothing. No career, no savings, no future. You're a broke nobody, and you always have been." He said it slowly, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been saving a line for the right stage. His attorney, a silver-haired man named Plunkett, was seated to his left with a pen in his hand and no visible reaction. My attorney, Renata Bowman, was seated to my right, and she did not flinch either, because I had prepared her for this moment weeks in advance, because I had known Marcus Holt for 11 years and I knew the shape of how he ended things. 4 people in a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio. A gray Tuesday in February. The river was invisible through the low cloud. I had worn my navy wool coat because that building always ran cold. I sat with my hands folded on the table. My face was completely still. I said nothing at all. What Marcus did not know, what no one in that conference room knew except me and a man named Douglas Crane in a law office 40 miles east in Milford, Ohio, was that 3 weeks earlier I had received a certified letter from Hartwell and Crane, attorneys at law, informing me that my grandfather, Edmund Philip Whitmore, had passed away in November and left behind an estate currently being appraised at approximately $72 million. I was the sole named beneficiary of a trust he had been building in absolute silence for 40 years. Every acre of timberland in eastern Tennessee he had ever purchased quietly over 4 decades. Every share of a gravel aggregate company that had compounded through 3 corporate acquisitions until the original $11,000 stake had become something no one who knew Edmund would have believed. Municipal bonds. A cash trust account funded carefully in my name since I was 8 years old. All of it was already in a separate protective trust structure in my name, at a bank Marcus had no relationship with, documented and verified and sealed by 2 attorneys before Marcus Holt had ever decided to pick up the phone and call Plunkett. I did not correct him. I did not smile. I did not give him anything at all. I picked up my pen, signed the settlement agreement that awarded Marcus the lake house in Harlan County, the joint investment accounts we had built together over 9 years, and the dark gray Range Rover. He washed himself every Sunday morning with a chamois cloth and a ritual that was, I think, his truest form of prayer. Then I stood, buttoned my navy coat, and walked out of that building into a gray February morning. The folded valuation summary was in my left coat pocket. $72,300,000. Final figure. I had been carrying it there all morning. That was 9 months ago. This is that story. Before we go any further, I want to know where in the world you are right now. Drop your city or your country in the comments below and tell me what time it is there. I say this every time, and I mean it every time. There is something that genuinely moves me when I see a comment from someone in Nairobi or Oslo or Kuala Lumpur or Calgary, sitting with one of these stories at whatever hour the day has handed them. If the story of a woman who stayed quiet and patient and let the most important truth in the room speak for itself is the kind of story you needed today, please like this video and subscribe to Revenge Diary. Every story on this channel exists for the woman who was counted out before the count was finished. Stay with me. I promise it is worth the time. To understand what happened in that conference room and why it landed the way it did, you need to understand the 11 years that lived inside it. You need to understand who Marcus Lawrence Holt was, who I was when I met him, and the specific, patient, decades-long education my grandfather had been giving me without ever calling it that. Marcus Holt was 41 years old when we divorced, and had been a senior partner at a commercial real estate brokerage called Holt Caldwell Associates for 7 years. The firm handled transactions for industrial park developers, regional shopping center operators, and mixed-use residential commercial projects along the I-75 corridor between Cincinnati and Dayton. He was very good at his work. He had the kind of intelligence that is most comfortable in rooms where it is the dominant intelligence, and he had spent enough years in those rooms that he had stopped checking whether he was still the smartest person in them. He drove a dark gray Range Rover that he washed himself every Sunday morning, with a bucket and a chamois cloth he kept on a hook in the garage. He had grown up in Indian Hill, one of the wealthiest suburbs of Cincinnati, the son of a corporate defense attorney named Richard and a woman named Helen, who sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations, a hospital committee, and a historic preservation society. His family's house in Indian Hill had a swimming pool in the backyard, a guest suite over the garage, a Christmas card that arrived at 50 homes each December, looking professionally styled because it was, every year without exception. Richard Holt had gone to Kenyon College. Marcus had gone to the University of Cincinnati on an academic scholarship and had spent the following 20 years behaving as though the scholarship was a minor interruption in what should always have been a private school trajectory. I met Marcus when I was 23, and he was 30. I was working as an administrative coordinator at a title company in Covington, Kentucky, the town directly across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, where the rent was lower and the river was visible from the bridge on the way to work every morning. He came in on a Thursday afternoon in October to close a transaction on a strip mall acquisition in Florence. He was in a charcoal suit, and he was 20 minutes early, which he used to charm the receptionist and ask me 3 questions about the title search process that I understood were not really about the title search process. After the closing, he stayed in the lobby, leaning against the reception desk, talking about nothing in particular, and then he asked for my number in the tone of a man who had rarely been told no. I gave it to him. We dated for 2 years. He was decisive and self-assured, and in those early years, he paid attention to me in a way that felt rare, the kind of focused attention that people mistake for love, when what it actually is interest in the project of being with someone. I understand that now. I did not understand it at 23. We were married in May when I was 25, at a restored farmhouse in Lebanon, Ohio. A small ceremony, 50 guests. Marcus would have preferred something larger and more visible, but he conceded on venue when I held firm on the guest list, which was the first and one of the only times I held firm on anything in the marriage, a fact I have spent considerable time examining since. His parents came and were gracious in the careful, practiced way of people who have accepted a situation they did not entirely choose, but have decided to absorb without visible complaint. Helen Holt hugged me at the reception with the precise warmth of a woman who has attended enough functions to know how long a hug should last. My mother, Patricia Whitmore, was there in a blue dress she had bought from a department store in Norwood, and altered herself at the kitchen table over 2 evenings with a seam ripper and careful pins. She had spent 22 years cleaning other people's houses, not just cleaning them but managing them, understanding their systems and their rhythms and the specific logic of how a family arranges its life across its surfaces. She had the kind of quiet competence that becomes invisible to people who only see the job title and not the intelligence executing it. She sat in the front row and she cried when I walked down the aisle, and she did not say a single word all day that was not either kind or true. Grandpa Edmund drove from Milford in his 10-year-old Buick Regal. He wore a dark blue suit that fit him the way a well-kept suit fits a man who has worn it to enough important occasions that it has memorized his posture. He shook Marcus's hand at the cocktail hour and said something I did not hear, and Marcus nodded with his professional smile, and I noticed that Edmund offered nothing beyond that exchange, which at the time I read as shyness and now understand was assessment. He found me near the dessert table 20 minutes before the reception ended, held both of my hands and said, "You call me Sunday, same as always." I told him I would. He kissed my cheek. He drove himself back to Milford at 8:15 in the evening in the Buick Regal, and I watched his taillights disappear through the farmhouse window, and I felt the specific ache of not wanting him to go that I had felt since I was 8 years old. And it was always Sunday evening, and the call was always ending. I need to tell you who Edmund was, because the story does not hold its shape without him. Edmund Philip Whitmore was born in Brown County, Ohio, in 1937, the 4th of 7 children of a tobacco farmer, and a woman who kept the household accounts on the back of an envelope and never made an arithmetic error. He left at 17 with $60, took a factory job in Cincinnati making machine parts, and worked overtime shifts for 11 straight years, while living in a rooming house in Norwood where the rent was $40 a month and the landlady made soup on Fridays. He saved. He did not talk about saving. He did not talk about money at all, which is not the same as not thinking about it. In 1963, when he was 26 years old, he purchased 40 acres of timberland in eastern Tennessee from a timber company that was selling off peripheral parcels. He paid $8,000, which was most of what he had. He told no one in the family. The land sat in his name and appreciated slowly, and he let it. Over the following 3 decades, he made additional purchases when adjacent parcels became available through the same small land brokerage in Monroe County, Tennessee, always for cash, always documented carefully, always held quietly. By the time of his death, those 40 original acres had grown to 240, appraised at $31,200,000. In 1971, he bought a stake in a small gravel aggregate company operating in 3 counties in southern Ohio. The company supplied gravel and crushed stone to county road departments and small construction firms. It was not a glamorous investment. It was a precise one. The stake cost him $11,000. The company was acquired by a regional infrastructure firm in 1983, which was itself acquired by a national materials corporation in 2001, which went through an initial public offering in 2008. Edmund had never sold a single share through any of the transitions. His original $11,000 stake had compounded through 3 ownership structures and 1 market cycle into an asset worth, at the time of his death, $27,840,000. He also held a municipal bond portfolio he had assembled over 20 years, reinvesting the interest payments without exception. At the time of his death, it was valued at $9,100,000. He drove old cars. He lived in a modest house on Caraway Street in Milford, with a vegetable garden in the backyard and a kitchen that smelled like instant coffee and the particular linseed soap he had used for 60 years. He wore flannel shirts. He read history books from the county library and returned them on time. He volunteered 1 morning a week at the food pantry at St. Thomas Church. He never described himself as anything other than a retired factory worker, because that was the first thing he had been, and he believed first things deserved to be named. He called me every Sunday evening from the time I was 8 years old until the Sunday 3 weeks before he died, when his voice was quieter than usual and a little farther away. And he said, "I'm proud of you, Claire. Not for anything particular you've done, just for how you're doing it." I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "You will." I told him I would call him next Sunday. He said he would look forward to it. That was the last Sunday call. He established the Edmund Philip Whitmore Family Trust in 1998, the same year my father left and my mother started working double shifts. I was 8 years old. He had named me the sole beneficiary and had instructed Douglas Crane, his attorney at Hartwell and Crane in Milford, to hold the trust documents in strictest confidence and to contact me within 30 days of Edmund's death with a complete accounting. He had funded the trust initially with a modest amount and added to it steadily over the following 24 years as his holdings grew and as his understanding of what the trust was for became more certain. He had also, I would learn later, declined on 2 separate occasions, when my father had contacted him looking for a personal loan, and on one occasion when Marcus had asked, through me and with the careful casualness of a man pretending not to care about the answer, whether Edmund had any plans for the Milford property or any of his holdings. Edmund had told me about that conversation on a Sunday call the following week and said only, I told him I hadn't made any decisions. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I understand it completely now. He also made 1 phone call to Douglas Crane in the year before he died, Douglas told me later, to confirm that all the documents were current and the beneficiary designation was correct and nothing had changed. Douglas said yes, nothing had changed. Edmund said, good. That was the entire call. Edmund was not a man who used more words than a situation required. He never told me about the trust because he did not want me building my life around a net. He wanted me to know who I was before he told me what I had. He wanted the money to arrive after the character was already formed, because he understood from his own life that a net underneath you can change the way you walk, and he did not want to change the way I walked. He wanted me to walk the way I walked. That was the inheritance he cared most about. The $72 million was the second thing. Back to Marcus and the marriage. Because the betrayal lives in the particular dimensions of the ordinary life, and you need to understand those dimensions to understand why the conference room moment was what it was. The first time I can name precisely when I understood the shape of what I was inside was Thanksgiving of our 2nd year of marriage. Marcus had invited his parents, Richard and Helen, and his sister Dana and her husband Christopher to our house in Hyde Park. I had prepared for 2 full days. I brined a turkey overnight in the kitchen, made 3 side dishes from scratch, tested a cranberry sauce recipe twice in the weeks before, and baked 2 pies. My mother came as well, and she was gracious and quiet, and sat at the far end of the table near Dana's youngest daughter, and asked her about kindergarten. At some point during the meal, Richard Holt mentioned a warehouse park transaction Marcus had just closed in Dayton, and said he had always known Marcus had the right kind of instincts for this work. Marcus said, "I learned from watching the right people." He was looking at his father when he said it. His gaze did not move to include me. Across the table, Helen was asking Dana about their plans for Christmas. My mother was looking at the cranberry sauce she had complimented me on twice. I passed the gravy to Richard and said nothing. After the guests left and Marcus had gone upstairs, I stood at the sink washing the good china and I thought, he has never once watched me work and registered that I was working. He has watched me prepare this meal for 2 days, and in his version of this afternoon, the meal appeared. The second moment was in the spring of our 3rd year. I had been managing a freelance bookkeeping practice from the study in our house for 2 years at that point. I had 8 regular clients, small businesses, a contractor, a dental practice, a florist, 2 retail shops. I was good at it. I understood numbers the way I understood language, naturally and without needing to translate. I told Marcus I was considering a formal accounting credential, perhaps building toward a small advisory firm. He set down his glass of Cabernet and looked at me with the expression of a man delivering unwelcome medical news as gently as possible. "Claire, you're 37 years old." I was 28. He had aged me by 9 years without registering the error. "Be realistic," he said. "We don't need a second income. We need you to be present here. Keep the bookkeeping if it makes you happy, but keep it small. It's not the moment for big ambitions." He said it warmly. He said it as though he were protecting me from something. That night, after he was asleep, I sat in the kitchen and wrote in a small notebook I kept in the back of a kitchen drawer. September. Accounting certification program. Enrolled. The third moment was a dinner Marcus hosted for Gregor Vance, one of the firm's largest clients, at a restaurant called Provision in downtown Cincinnati. Gregor was in town for 2 days, closing a deal, and Marcus assembled 4 colleagues and their spouses for a table of 10. It was a Thursday evening in November, and I wore a dark green dress, and I had prepared questions about Gregor's projects the way I prepared everything, specifically and quietly. Somewhere during the main course, Gregor turned to me directly and said, "Claire, what's your background professionally?" I started to say I had been managing a bookkeeping practice for 6 years with 11 clients and was expanding toward a full accounting service. Marcus put his hand on my forearm, a light touch but precise. "She does a little work from home," he said, "nothing too formal. She's really the anchor of the household, which is what makes everything else possible." He smiled at Gregor as he said it. He kept his hand on my forearm for 2 more seconds. I smiled and said, "Tell me about the Columbus project." Marcus mentioned the zoning variance was complex. The conversation moved. Marcus lifted his hand. I sat beside him for the rest of the dinner and thought about the $4,300 I had invoiced that month from 11 clients, and the accounting software platform I had purchased 6 weeks earlier to accommodate the 12th, and the certification exam I had passed in August with a score of 91%. He did not know about the credit union account in Florence, Kentucky, where my bookkeeping income had been depositing for 4 years. He did not know I had 12 clients by then. He did not know because I had stopped telling him things I cared about somewhere in the middle of year 4, when I understood that the version of me he had decided on was not going to be revised by information. There was also the matter of the receipts, which is how I knew the marriage was ending before either of us said it. In April of our 9th year, I found a receipt in the inside pocket of a blazer I was taking to the dry cleaner. A restaurant called 11, 48 miles southeast of Cincinnati. Dinner for 2. A Tuesday night in March when Marcus had told me he was at a site walk in Hamilton County. The total was $242 for 2 people, which included a bottle of wine I recognized from the name as something significantly above his usual preference for client dinners. I set the receipt on the kitchen counter. He came home after midnight and I was already in bed. In the morning, the receipt was gone. I did not confront him. I filed the information the way I had been filing everything about my life for years, carefully, without reaction for later use. When Grandpa Edmund died in November of our 10th year, I was on a plane to Milford within 5 hours of the phone call. My mother was already there when I arrived, sitting in Edmund's kitchen at the table where he had eaten every meal for 30 years, holding a cup of his terrible instant coffee with both hands, and the kitchen smelled like him in a way that made me stand in the doorway for a moment before I could walk through it. We stayed 3 days together, going through his things without hurrying, the way you do when you know that hurrying is the one thing you cannot afford. I found his Sunday call log on the 4th shelf of his bookcase, a small spiral notebook with his handwriting tracking every call, my name, the date, and 2 or 3 words about what we had talked about. The log went back 26 years. 26 years of Sunday evenings, 4 words per entry. I put it in my bag. It is on my desk now. Marcus came to Milford for the funeral on Thursday. He flew to Atlanta for a client meeting on Friday morning. He hugged me at the airport and said Edmund was a good man. He got into a rideshare. I sat in the car in the airport parking structure for 11 minutes before I drove back to Milford to help my mother handle the estate logistics. 3 weeks after the funeral, the certified letter arrived. I read it at the kitchen table in Hyde Park at 8:17 in the morning on a Wednesday, while Marcus was already at the firm. The letter from Hartwell and Crane was 2 pages. I read it twice, stood up, made a cup of coffee, sat back down, and read it a 3rd time. Then I called Douglas Crane. Douglas Crane was 61, a methodical and unhurried man who had managed Edmund's affairs for 11 years and who spoke about my grandfather with the particular warmth of someone who had genuinely liked him. He walked me through the estate in order, without rushing me, going back to re-explain anything I asked him to repeat. The timberland in Tennessee, 240 acres, current appraisal $31,200,000. The aggregate company's stake, realized value pending final transfer $27,840,000. The municipal bond portfolio $9,100,000. The cash trust account, funded and compounding for 24 years, $4,360,000. Total estate value, pending final documents, $72,300,000. He read the number the way you read a number that you have become accustomed to, without drama. I wrote it on the bottom corner of the first page of the letter and looked at it for a long time. He asked if I had an attorney I trusted. I said I would find one. He said he would have documents ready whenever I needed them. That night, Marcus talked about a retail center deal he was pursuing in Kenwood. He talked for 15 minutes. He asked me to pass the salt. I passed it. I watched his hands and thought about my grandfather's hands, the ones that had called me every Sunday for 26 years, and never mentioned once what was being built in the background while we talked about my week. The next morning, I called Renata Bauman. Renata was 46, a partner at a firm in Cincinnati, and she had been referred to me 2 years earlier by one of my bookkeeping clients, who mentioned her name in a context that had nothing to do with my circumstances at the time, but which I had filed in the back of the small notebook in the kitchen drawer, because I had developed a habit of filing things I might need later. She had short, gray-streaked hair cut sharp at the jaw, and she did not use a notepad in the first meeting, which I later understood was characteristic. She processed while listening and then produced from memory the details most people would have needed to write down. I told her everything in our first meeting. The trust, the timeline, the marriage, the bookkeeping accounts he didn't know about, the receipt from the restaurant in April, the 11 years of being introduced as my wife without a name. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 6 seconds. Then she said, "I need you to understand the asset protection priority here. This inheritance is separate property under Ohio law because it derives entirely from Edmund's assets and was received as an inheritance. However, any commingling with marital funds, even a single transfer to a joint account, can compromise that status and expose a portion to equitable distribution claims. Before any divorce proceeding is initiated, we need to have this inheritance legally structured and isolated. We have a window of time. I want to use all of it." She paused. "How long have you been thinking about divorcing him?" I said, "Long enough to know it's not a reaction." She said, "Good. Then let's build something he cannot reach." Over the following 8 weeks, Renata and Douglas Crane worked in parallel with the quiet efficiency of 2 professionals who understand that time is the most important resource in a legal protection strategy. Every meeting was conducted in person, at Renata's office or at Hartwell and Crane in Milford, never by phone, never by email that could be subpoenaed or intercepted. The Edmund Philip Whitmore Family Trust was transferred through Hartwell and Crane into a new protected entity in my name at First National Heritage Bank in Cincinnati, an institution Marcus had no accounts with and no existing relationship to. Every dollar was documented with a complete provenance trail, demonstrating that every asset derived from Edmund's premarital acquisitions or postmarital inheritance, clean under Ohio law. Renata had a forensic accountant review the entire transfer structure to ensure there was no argument, no ambiguity, no seam in the documentation that Barrett Plunkett or anyone else could pull at. The prenuptial agreement Marcus had requested before our wedding, drafted by his family's attorney to protect Marcus's premarital assets, had no provisions addressing my potential inheritance, because at 25 I had had nothing to protect, and no one had thought to ask whether that might change. It had been drafted to run in one direction, protecting his assets from any claim I might make, and it had been so narrowly focused on that single concern that it had failed entirely to account for the possibility that I might someday have assets of my own worth protecting. Renata noted this with the specific, professional tone of someone making a mental note about the intent behind a document and what that intent revealed about the person who had commissioned it. I also, during those 8 weeks, had a difficult and necessary conversation with myself about the bookkeeping clients. I had 12 clients by January, regular, paying clients who depended on me for accurate monthly financials, payroll processing, and quarterly tax filings. They knew me as Claire Whitmore. None of them knew about the inheritance, and none of them needed to. I continued working. I delivered every report on time. I answered every email. I did not allow the fact that I was restructuring my entire financial and legal existence in the background to interrupt the work I had committed to, because that is not how I operate, and it is not what Edmund had raised me to be. The work was the work, and it ran on its own clock, separate from everything else. Renata asked me in our third meeting whether I felt ready to file. I told her I would know when I was ready. She said, "You'll know when the documentation is complete, not when the emotion is resolved. Those are two different clocks." She was right. On the 15th of January, Renata confirmed that every document was in order, every transfer was recorded, every provenance was established. I drove home from her office and sat in my car in the driveway of the Hyde Park house for 6 minutes. I went inside. Marcus was in the study. I said goodnight. I went upstairs. The next morning, I called Renata's office at 9:03 and said, "File it." During those 8 weeks, I continued living in our house in Hyde Park. I made dinners. I attended the firm's holiday party in December at the Netherland Plaza Hotel downtown, where Marcus introduced me to a new client named Gordon as my wife, and to a second client named Patrick as the home base of the operation. I smiled at both of them and asked one genuine question each. Marcus wore his Christmas Eve expression of benevolent satisfaction. I wore a black dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only fine jewelry my mother had owned, which she had given me after Edmund's funeral, pressed into my hands in a small velvet pouch without a word. On Christmas morning, Marcus gave me a silver bracelet with a small sapphire clasp and told me it had cost $1,800. I thanked him and clasped it on my wrist, and thought about the daily interest accumulating in a trust account he had no knowledge of and no access to. I filed for divorce in January, on a Tuesday morning. Marcus's initial reaction moved through confusion, then irritation, then the wounded performance of a man who has decided to be the injured party before the facts are in. He hired Barrett Plunkett immediately. Barrett's first move was a request for full financial disclosure, which Renata had anticipated and prepared for with complete precision. My disclosure included my bookkeeping income, the credit union account in Florence, and my beneficial interest in the Edmund Philip Whitmore Family Trust, documented, verified, and filed with the county. Barrett filed a motion to challenge the separate property status of the trust. The motion failed. He filed 2 additional challenges over the following 6 weeks. Both failed. The documentation was airtight, and the law was clear. By the time the settlement conference was scheduled for February, Marcus knew the trust was untouchable. He had known it for 3 weeks. He had had 3 weeks to prepare something to say at the table when he signed the papers, and what he prepared was, "You're a broke nobody." The settlement gave him the lake house, the joint investment accounts, and the Range Rover. It gave me the full and unencumbered beneficial interest in an estate worth $72,300,000 and structured so cleanly that it would never require his signature or his acknowledgement or his understanding to remain exactly what it was. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and speak directly to you. If you are watching this right now and you have been in a room where someone handed you a smaller version of yourself and told you to carry it like it was the real one, I want you to drop a comment below right now. You do not have to say anything complex. You can just say, "I needed this today," because sometimes that is the whole sentence. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it right now, because the part of this story that lives in the ballroom is the part one have been building toward, and it is worth staying for. The public accounting happened not at the conference table but 6 weeks later, at a function I attended not as a strategy but as a rite. Let me explain the difference. Paulette Harding was the wealth management advisor at Meridian Capital Group in Cincinnati, who had been introduced to me by Douglas Crane in January. Paulette was 52, with 25 years managing high net worth portfolios, and she was direct and specific and treated my newness to all of this not as a deficiency to be managed, but as a clean slate she could actually work with. In our first meeting, she said, "The goal is not to change who you are. The goal is to build structures that protect it over a long time horizon." I understood her immediately. Through Paulette's firm, I was invited in March to the quarterly client reception at the Westin Cincinnati, a black tie optional event for approximately 200 clients and prospective clients. The firm managed portfolios with a minimum threshold of $10 million. Every person in that ballroom understood what an invitation from Paulette's firm meant. I attended alone. I wore a midnight blue dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings. I arrived at 7:15 and took a glass of sparkling water and stood near the windows overlooking the Ohio River and the Kentucky hills on the other side. I was speaking with a retired ophthalmologist named Walter Ewan and his wife when, at 7:47, I watched Marcus Holt walk through the ballroom doors. He had a woman from his office with him, Sasha, 31, whose name I had seen on his phone screen more times than I had ever said out loud to anyone. She was holding his arm and he was scanning the room the way he always did at these events, assembling the social landscape with the automatic competence of a man who had attended hundreds of rooms like this one and understood how they worked. I watched him locate 3 people he recognized and move toward them. I watched him work a group of 4 for 5 minutes. The handshake, the specific lean-in laugh, the business card that appears at the right moment. I watched him be excellent at the thing he was most excellent at. Then he turned and saw me. I watched it happen in real time across 60 feet of carpeted ballroom floor. The recognition. The recalibration. The specific expression that crosses a face when a person appears in a category you had never assigned them to. He said something to Sasha, something short. She glanced toward me once. He walked across the room toward me alone. He stopped 4 feet away. "Claire," he said my name the way you say a word you have been pronouncing wrong for years and have just encountered the correct form of. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I'm a client," I said, "since January." He processed that. Paulette Harding's firm, $10 million minimum. He was running the math behind his eyes. "Paulette's team," I added, naming it clearly. He said, "Oh, just that." One syllable containing the entire revision of a story he had been telling about me for 11 years, and all the places that story was no longer usable. I smiled at him. Not warmly, not coldly, the specific smile of a woman who has no outstanding accounts with the person in front of her. "Enjoy your evening, Marcus." I turned back to Walter and his wife. Behind me, I heard Marcus stand still for approximately 3 seconds. Then he walked away. Paulette found me near the end of the evening. She had watched the exchange from across the room, and she was too professional to ask directly. But she caught my eye and held it for one moment, and gave me the particular nod of someone recognizing the correct conclusion of a long process. I nodded once in return. We moved on to discussing the portfolio rebalancing she had proposed for the second quarter. Gregor Vance was there. The same Gregor Vance from the provision dinner 3 years earlier, the man in front of whom Marcus had kept his hand on my forearm to signal me to stop talking. Gregor found me near the buffet at 8:45, and he remembered me without prompting. "Claire Whitmore," he said, "I always thought your husband talked over you." I said, "He did. We've divorced." Gregor looked at me steadily. "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't be." He shook my hand at the end of the evening with the grip you give a person you respect and said, "You're in the right room." I thought about the provision dinner and the hand on my forearm and the words "nothing too formal," and I thought about Edmund's call log going back 26 years, and I said, I was always in the right room. It just took a while for the room to catch up. I drove home at 10:43 and sat in my car in the parking garage of my new apartment in Oakley for 9 minutes, not crying, not celebrating, sitting in the particular quiet of something that has been finished correctly. Marcus called once, 3 weeks after the conference. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 7 minutes and 14 seconds long, which I know because I listened to it twice before archiving it. He said he had underestimated me. He said the marriage had been complicated by pressures at the firm and a period of personal confusion. He said he thought they had both contributed to the distance. The word "sorry" appeared in the 4th minute. "I'm sorry if I wasn't always the most supportive partner you needed." I archived the message. I did not call back. There was no obligation in that direction, and I felt none. Dana, his sister, texted me in April. "I always knew you were stronger than he gave you credit for. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." I waited 3 weeks and texted 2 sentences. "Thank you. That meant something." Both were true. My mother found out in March. I drove to Norwood on a Saturday afternoon and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything from the beginning. The trust, Edmund's 40 years, the letter, Renata, the 8 weeks of preparation, the conference room, what Marcus said, and the final number. She listened without speaking for the entire account. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He always told me you were the one who understood things quietly. He said it more than once to me over the years." She started crying. I started crying. We sat at that table for 2 hours talking about Edmund Whitmore and his Buick and his terrible instant coffee and the Sunday calls and all the things he had seen and never announced, because he understood that the announcement was not the point. The work was the point. I found her a house in Madeira that spring. A 1-story brick house on a street with oak trees and a front porch that caught the morning light and a deep backyard with a garden bed along the south fence that had been planted by the previous owner but not maintained. She did not ask me for anything. She never did. I drove her past the house on a Thursday evening before any paperwork was signed, and she looked at it through the car window from the street and said, "It has a real garden." I said she could do whatever she wanted with it. She bought 6 varieties of tomatoes the following weekend. The transfer of funds through the trust took 40 minutes of paperwork. 40 minutes to give my mother the first house she had ever owned after 22 years of cleaning other people's. I opened Whitmore Financial in July, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. Not Marcus's name, not the married name I had carried for 9 years. Edmund's name. The name that had called me every Sunday for 26 years and known something about me, long before I knew it about myself. I leased a single-room office on the 3rd floor of a building in Hyde Park, the same neighborhood where I had spent 9 years of marriage, because I had decided I was not going to be displaced from the neighborhood I had come to love because someone else had made poor decisions. The office had 2 desks, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over a line of oak trees, and a small wooden shelf on the wall where I put Edmund's tackle box on the first day. Renata Bowman referred 2 clients in the first month. Paulette Harding referred 3. By November, I had 14 clients, 9 of them women who had, at various points in their lives, been told by someone with authority over their confidence that financial management was not really for someone like them, that it was too complicated or too intimidating, or better left to someone who had studied for it, which was a sentence always deployed by people who had something to gain from the listener's self-doubt. Every one of those 9 women was capable. Every one of them had been told otherwise. I took their accounts and did the work and showed them the work, line by line, because understanding your own financial picture is not optional and never should have been presented as something you could outsource to someone whose interests were not yours. I hired Grace Abernathy in September, 24 years old, freshly certified in accounting, competent in a way that her previous employer had treated as a statistical anomaly rather than a consistent pattern worth investing in. I told Grace on her first day, "The work speaks. Our job is to let it, and to make sure the people we serve understand what they are hearing when it does." Grace's response was to sit down at her desk and open the first client file with a focus that told me I had hired exactly the right person. By December, 6 months into operation, Whitmore Financial had 16 clients and had processed $412,000 in client invoicing on their behalf. I had also, through Paulette's guidance, begun the first round of planned charitable giving from the trust, establishing a scholarship fund at the University of Cincinnati in Edmund Whitmore's name for first-generation college students pursuing accounting or finance credentials. The first 2 recipients were announced in October. I attended the ceremony. I sat in a row of strangers and felt my grandfather very close, the way you feel someone who has shaped you in a room where their values are visible. What I want to say in the space where an ending should go is this. Marcus Holt told me I was a broke nobody. He said it with precision and satisfaction in a room with 4 witnesses. And at the moment he said it, I had $72 million in a trust he could never touch, built by a man who had known since I was 8 years old that I was worth building for. I did not correct Marcus. I signed the page and buttoned my coat and walked into February. And I think about that choice now, not with regret or triumph, but with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she had ever done was let someone finish being wrong about her and let the truth handle everything that came after. There is a version of this story where I said something in that conference room, where I opened my coat and showed him the valuation summary and watched his face change in real time. I understand why people imagine that scene. It is a satisfying scene to imagine, but it would have required me to need something from him in that moment, some acknowledgement, some reaction, some performance of his own humiliation. And I did not need anything from him in that moment. I had not needed anything from him for a very long time. The silence was not restraint. It was sufficiency. I had everything I needed in that coat pocket, and in the 11 years of quiet work that had led to that coat pocket, and Marcus Holt's face crumbling across a conference table was not a thing I required in order to be complete. If someone in your life has handed you a smaller version of yourself and told you to carry it like it is accurate, I want to say something directly to you. The inventory of who you are does not require their approval to be real. The work you are doing in the quiet, the documentation, the certification, the separate account, the patient accumulation of evidence of your own capability, that is not nothing. That is the whole thing. Do the work. Protect what is yours. And when the room finally figures out what was in front of it the whole time, let the room figure it out. You do not need to announce the arrival of your own worth. It will show up exactly when it is ready, wearing exactly the right coat. What would you have done at that conference table? Would you have corrected him right there in that room? Or would you have let the signed page do all the talking? I want every answer in the comments. I read them all. Thank you for sitting with this story today. I mean that sincerely, every single time I say it, because it is true every single time. You chose this video out of everything available to you this hour, and that choice is not something I take lightly. If any part of this story landed for you, if something in Claire's patience or Edmund's quiet faith, or the specific silence of that conference room morning touched something you recognize, please share it with someone who needs it today. And if you are watching this in a difficult moment of your own, if you are the woman in the room being spoken over right now, I want you to know that the page you are on is not the last page. Subscribe to Revenge Diary so you never miss another story. We release a new episode every single day, and every one of them is for you. The quiet ones always have the most to say. I will see you in the next one.